Hello, everyone. Happy Election Day. There's a full moon tonight, which I don't know what that means for us, but I thought that was pretty cool driving in. I am beyond honored, let's see if I can even say it without a shaky voice, to share the stage with Rebecca tonight, who is sort of the Mount Rushmore of investigative editors. She would certainly be on it, even though she would. Maybe not right now. But we will, I have a bunch of questions, including some that were reader submitted, to chat with Rebecca about, and then we will try and leave a little bit of time at the end for some reader, hopefully you're all readers, but audience questions. So first, I want to point out that Stephanie mentioned that Rebecca did attend Colby College and started her career at Morning Sentinel. Which I would like to add that you met your husband in the newsroom at the Morning Sentinel, and so Maine has had an outsized impact on your life, and we're very happy to have you up here and coming back often. We hope, but I wanted to ask, since you have been back and forth for many years, what was the original appeal of Maine, and what have you noticed has changed over the years?
First of all, when I was contemplating where to go to college, I was not part of the era where everyone applied to 100 colleges and had counselors and thought a great deal about it, I'm afraid. And I did do a short college tour with my mother, and we did go to Colby, but I have to honestly say I don't remember the tour at all. But I did remember Maine, and I just felt this immediate attraction to it. And so Colby ended up being my introduction to the state of Maine. And, the immediate appeal was all the usual things that drew people then and still draw people now. It's natural beauty, the coast, the mountains, the forest, the vast swaths of rural areas. But I also soon realized that Maine was a place where the people there felt a strong sense of place. And to me, that was really interesting because I grew up in new suburbs where there was no history, there was no downtown, there was no real core. And that sense of identity and the fact that there were many small towns and many small cities that had, sort of a real sense of community was both really intriguing and appealing to me. In terms of change, what I'd say is the thing that is perhaps most profound over, the decades since I first started coming to Maine, was the transformation of the manufacturing industrial economy to a somewhat post-industrial economy, which of course affected many states in many different ways. And Waterville was a very good example of it. It had, when I was there, it had a huge, paper mill. It had Hathaway shirts. It had textiles. It had outside were the shoe industry and the poultry industry, which I know well because my father-in-law was in poultry, and that was an industry that moved south over the years. And this transformation is still playing out, of course, very much across national politics in many ways in many states. And the struggle, some states have done quite well in creating new industries that provide new jobs for primarily blue collar workers, and others have not. And so I think that there's all sorts of fallout from that, but that was really, I think, the big thing that is really, remarkable to me.
So let's go back a little bit to your days at the Morning Sentinel. The first time we met for coffee, you told me some pretty great stories from those first few weeks on the job. Will you just tell everyone what was your job at the Morning Sentinel, and maybe your favorite memory from your time there?
Sure. Um, so when I was an accidental journalist, I didn't intend to be a journalist. Um, I had other ideas when I went to college, and but when I graduated, my only job was as a lifeguard at the Colby Pool. Um, I had been the editor of the college paper, and I was deeply interested in writing and literature, and I had decided that maybe journalism would be a good thing to try. It was during a recession. I wrote to probably 50 newspapers, and they were actual newspapers back then, not just news organizations, as we now say. And I think I got about 3 responses, which were all no. The others didn't even bother. And one day, somebody in town told me, "Oh, there's a job at the Morning Sentinel." So I walked over there. I did not make an appointment. Um, and I sat down with a woman who was the state editor, and she interviewed me for, I don't know, 45 minutes or an hour. They did not conduct a national search for the best candidate for the job. They did not conduct a state search for the best candidate. Somehow, I was there. I could be had really cheaply, and I guess she decided I was trainable. So I was hired as the assistant state editor, and the word editor is applied very, very loosely here. I ended up ascending to be the state editor sometime later. But my very first hour of my first day on the job began disastrously. Soon after she told me I was hired and let's start right now, which was pretty amazing. I don't think they did reference checks either. Um, she took a phone call, then said, okay, then handed me the phone and said, take an obit. And now, firstly, I will say, I was a reader of newspapers. I was a very diligent reader of newspapers. I was 21 years old. Why would I read the obituaries? So I wasn't overly familiar with the format, but so I take the phone. This funeral director starts rattling off information about, as he termed the subject, the deceased. And I am barely with the manual typewriter, stuffing paper into it and starting, trying to take dictation. And the deceased had a very unusual last name. It was a Yankee name, and I wasn't sure the spelling. All of the deceased relatives had equally complicated last names that were even more baffling to me. And the deceased belonged to many, many fraternal organizations with very strange names that I had never heard of. The one that sticks in my brain was the Knights of Pythias. And I do remember thinking, who is Pythias? And then he hung up. I look at what I have typed, and I missed about the first third of it because he began talking before he even got the paper and the typewriter. And it was gibberish. It was, oh, I was also, he had a very strong Maine accent and talked fast. I was a fast typist, but a very reckless one. So it was gibberish. And I thought, in my first hour, I was just hired and now I will be fired. So there was nothing to do but confess to the editor. She laughed, gave me his name and phone number. I had to call him back and say, will you repeat everything slowly? And I'm going to need you to spell every single name. And I never made a mistake in an obituary after that. It was a very, very good lesson in what not to do. But my favorite memory of working at the Sentinel was when I ascended to the grand job of state editor. There was a network of part-time correspondents all across the Sentinel circulation area, which was very large. And most of it was older women, and they would send in, everything from what happened at the selectmen's meeting to the 4-H winners to the out-of-town guests, and most amazingly, in the age of HIPAA, who went into the hospital. Um, and so one day, one of the real reporters in the newsroom calls me and says, I just got a call from the state trooper out in Farmington. And he said there was a homicide in one of these other towns. And I said, what? And so I hang up, I call our correspondent, who was an older woman. She was way overqualified for the job. My memory tells me that she had studied classics at Bates. Because of my experience with obituaries, I don't want to mislead anyone here. I tried to confirm this last night while I was Googling around, but I couldn't find any record of it. So maybe somehow she didn't have a degree in classics from Bates, but somehow everyone in the newsroom thought she did. And the one time I visited her at her home, her living room was empty except for 4 Boston rockers that all faced each other. So when I visited her, she was rocking in her chair, and I was rocking at her chair, in my chair, and we had a very robust discussion, and it was a lot of fun. She gave me clips of a Christmas cactus that lived with me through 3 states, and it always made me think of her. So, back to the homicide. As soon as I hear this story from the other reporter, I call her and say, Lucille, do you know anything about a killing in your town? And she says, yes. And I said, well, why didn't you call us about it? As you all know, Maine does not have a lot of violent crime, and back then it had even less. And she said, I thought it reflected poorly upon the community. I dispatched the real reporter in the next phone call.
I love that one. I will say, I do want to point out that Ever, the investigative editor, she was investigating her own story last night to make sure she got it all right, which I think.
I didn't want to have to publish a correction.
Exactly. So moving on to sort of one of the pinnacles of your career that I think gets a lot of play that I know a lot of people in this room probably want to hear about, which is the investigation into Harvey Weinstein. So from the Morning Sentinel to the New York Times, with the stop in the Baltimore Sun in between, right? So the 2 reporters on that story, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, did I say it? Toohey, called you their true north in the acknowledgments of She Said, their very good book, you should all read it, about reporting the Harvey Weinstein investigation. What do you think is the responsibility of an editor to her reporters in an investigation as high profile and important as that one?
I mean, I don't think there is anything particularly different whether, you're editing a, smaller scale story, or whether you're doing a sort of much longer term investigative story. Some of how you get the information and the struggles to get it can be very, very different. But I think that editors play many different roles and at different times during the course of investigative stories. And at the beginning, you're sort of a guide. What are the questions we are trying to answer? And that story began with a question that the Times had published shortly before all of this started, a story about Bill O'Reilly. And Bill O'Reilly, who was one of the major stars of cable television, was fired after the Times revelations about his record of settlements for sexual harassment. And so there was a discussion among some Times editors and reporters about are there other industries that we should look at where there might be similar hidden histories like this? And people suggested certain industries that involved more service workers and blue collar workers. People suggested, tech companies and whatever. and Jody Cantor was aware that there had been like rumors about Weinstein over the years, but no one had ever really found anything. And so we talked about the entertainment industry. And at the end of that discussion, we decided that she should do a little exploratory reporting and see if there seemed to be a there and if it was worth doing. So at the beginning of that, Jody and I talked a lot about, so what are the questions we're trying to answer? And what are the pathways to finding those answers? And then she didn't initially get any find anyone who told her a story about being victimized. But there were some unusual responses from some people she called, like someone who said, I can't talk about that, which is, if there's nothing to say, why would you say that? And so there was a lot of discussion about how to reach out to people, and how also with high profile people like actresses, there was, she believed, and it turned out to be a very good approach, that they may not have told this to very many people. And so you wouldn't want to go through their publicists, which is the usual way of reaching people like that. So you had to find intermediaries or direct connections where it could be kept more private. So there was a lot of that. At a certain point, it became clear that she learned about several incidents and of a settlement. And so then it became, all right, how do we get other women to talk? That before the Weinstein story, of course, their workplace sexual harassment had occurred. It's occurred for a very long time. This was not the first time that this was being revealed. But in most cases, the stories were about lawsuits or individual claims. And what we decided to do that was different from the usual way this had been covered was to use the tools of investigative journalism that we use in other stories and apply it to this. So instead of looking for one person making a claim, we wanted to see if there was a pattern of misconduct. Instead of having it be someone saying this, we wanted to see if there was documentation, if there were settlements, if this person had told other people in real time. And because that is what would make a persuasive case, if true, to readers, that this was a serious problem. It wasn't just something that happened between one man and one woman where you could not really, determine the facts at all. And so, at certain points, and Megan joined the reporting. She had been on maternity leave at the beginning of this, and then we learned it started with making calls to actresses because that's or reporting about the actresses because that's where we thought most of the victims likely would be if there were any. But then there was sort of a breakthrough moment when they got guidance that they should be looking at the people who worked for Weinstein, at his employees, who were people with no name recognition, who were generally young women who were aspiring to have a career in the film industry, and were particularly vulnerable because he was their employer. And that was a huge breakthrough in our thinking about the reporting. So many times in investigative stories, things fizzle. Sometimes there are real pivots that happen where you discover something and it's like, oh, we have to shift gears now. And sometimes, of course, the reporters were frustrated by, I've called so many people and haven't learned anything over the course of, a week. And sometimes there was, a lot of strategizing. And eventually there was a moment where there was an accumulation of information. And Weinstein, of course, had sort of heard through the grapevine that we were asking questions and desperately wanted to come in and talk to us, but he would not do it on the record. And we did not want to hear it off the record because that is unusable information to us. Off the record really means that you can't share it with anyone else, even for other reporting purposes. you can't publish it, certainly. And if he had something to say, it had to be usable information, which was very frustrating to him. So the other thing that I think is really important to do with investigative stories in particular, but with stories where, that are potentially have a lot of impact and a lot of consequence, is to look at it from other perspectives and be a little prosecutorial about the facts. And that means asking, how do we know this? How do we buttress the story? And is this enough to say we have, X number of women saying this? We knew at a certain point we had heard that there were X number of settlements. Can we show that? What documents do we have? A woman told us about a settlement, but we don't have the document. Can she find the document for us? Can we find this memo and publish this memo that someone else told us about? But to me, the scariest thing as an editor is not so much what's in the story, but what's not in the story, what you don't know. And sometimes there is this problem of people having the facts right, but the entire premise wrong, of 2 and 2 equals 5. And the worst mistakes in journalism, I think, are when that happens. And there have been some pretty famous cases of it. And thankfully, I've never been involved in any of that, and that was not the case here. But you always want to know, but do you understand the full context? What would make this, and again, this was not so much a case in this story, but there were certainly, questions of fairness and, what and when, when do we go to Weinstein? In many cases, you want to go early in a story because you generally don't know what's going to happen. But it was very clear that he was very much wanted to, and he called the editor of the paper, he called the publisher of the paper, and was told each time, if you want to talk, you have to talk to the reporters. And that is a way of the institution having our backs, and a way of saying, we're not going to protect you. The facts are the facts. But we got through, all of those hurdles, and it was a very dramatic last 48 hours before publication, where we had a call with him, and he had many lawyers in the room who were talking over each other. It was a very confusing conversation. And we had a discussion about how much time to give him to respond, because we know that he had reached out, and people working for him had reached out to some of the women they suspected may have been talking to us and cooperating with the investigation, and trying to intimidate them a bit. So in the end, we felt that we were ready. We'd done everything we could do, and we published.
So that's a great segue. There was a great photograph that Jody posted on her Instagram a year after you guys published, of you sort of sitting at a computer with, I think, Dean and the reporters hovering over you, about to push the button, and really change the world in a lot of ways once that button got pushed. And I just wondered, sort of, what did it feel like in that moment? And did you have any idea the magnitude of what would happen next?
So the first moment was, you're always slightly nervous when you're publishing an investigative story. And that photograph was taken when my dear colleague, Matt Purdy, who oversaw all the investigations in the New York Times and had helped a bit on that story, he always says, when you're ready to publish, let's just look at it one last time. And sometimes you still catch a typo or like a misplaced comma or something. And there was nothing, we didn't find anything, and so we published. And, at first there's relief, and then it's like, okay, let's see what happens. And I was really tired because I'd been up all night doing.
That's like a classic investigative editor move. I don't know how they all do it, but the night before something, they all don't sleep.
Well, it's also like in the last couple of days, you're reading everything, but you're doing tweaks to it. This paragraph up here, or let's move this around. But I had not read the whole thing as a whole again, without people around me for a day or so, and I just really needed to do that. And so I've been pretty much awake all night, and so and we didn't know, how he would react and what he would do, though we had gotten some pretty interesting statements from him, which we published. And no one could have predicted the response that story did. And it's not that that the New York Times set off the Me Too movement. Me Too existed as a hashtag, and before that, and had been a forum for victims of sexual abuse, not so much workplace misconduct to speak out, but it became a vehicle for this. But I think the reason that it took off in the way it did was because so many women, regular women with regular jobs, had some form, had experienced some form of workplace misconduct. And there's a huge, range of this. And it can be from, remarks that someone shouldn't have made to criminal activity, with much of it, sort of the spectrum, and with much of it, sort of in between or at the lower end. And I think what was so remarkable was, in a way, it was a wake-up call for so many men who discovered, because of the social conversations that took place, that their wives, their daughters, their sisters had all experienced this and never talked about it, because it was like as common as, well, who hasn't had this sort of experience, in the workplace? But I think it was also, in a way, women were fed up, and they had this actual vehicle to use to express it. And also, I mean, there's no question that the fact that this happened to celebrities gave it much higher visibility, but also celebrities who were famous and rich and felt helpless in the face of it too, because in almost all the cases they were young, they weren't that, well known, and so. And the Me Too movement is not the same as investigative journalism. There were many allegations that surfaced during that time, and they did not have to be vetted. Wouldn't meet the standards of investigative journalism, and I'm sure many of them may well have been true. Maybe some of them, I don't know. But I think that's the reason that this story somehow became the catalyst for that. And it was funny because at the beginning of the investigation, my friend again, Matt Purdy, said, well, like, how many people really know who Harvey Weinstein is? And sure, a lot didn't, but, a lot of people knew of his movies, and a lot of people knew who by this time, these were famous actresses. But the stories that I thought were the most incredibly compelling were the ones of his former employees. And if you ever saw the film version of it, there was one woman in particular really was remarkable, was this woman who had been, I think, 21 and had worked for him. It was her first job. She was excited about the film industry. She had, she talked about a very bad encounter she had with him, and it changed her whole life. And it changed what her ambition was and how she lived her life. And she was very, very nervous about speaking out. And I can't remember, it was the day before we published or the morning that we published, that she said, I'll let you use my name, which made a huge difference to the story.
So it's interesting, and you and I haven't talked about this, I don't think, but a few weeks later, I was at the Times-Picayune in the New Orleans at the time. Brett Anderson, who now works for the New York Times as a food writer, published an investigation into John Besh, who was a celebrity chef in New Orleans. And I think the fact that we went after you guys on the Weinstein story, I think it was actually more impactful in New Orleans because it was following this big sort of swing into a certain direction that meant I think he had less options to fight it or to deny it in some ways. And Brett did amazing reporting. I think he had 23 women in total by the time we were done. And it was really more about Besh's whole company and not just him. But I do think that there was many stories I think that followed about that were good investigative journalism that sort of rode the wave behind you guys and made maybe a bigger impact because of it.
Right. No, I think that's true. And like a lot of other organizations were writing stories, and the Times did many, many stories of people in many different industries. And there were also, and there was this whole sort of cultural discussion going on about what was the appropriate way of handling this. And in some cases, it did seem that some companies rushed to judgment.
100%.
Off with their head if there were any accusations against, a man. And there were discussions, with high school students about, what is appropriate. And I think these were great cultural discussions to have, and really, trying to define and sort of reach some sort of understanding, which I don't think we have fully
No.
reached this state of what's appropriate, and again, what was the misconduct, and what should be the appropriate level of reckoning for it.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, you've worked on a lot of different stories in your time in this industry, and the current climate is quite an interesting one to do work in. And I wondered if there's any in particular that sort of come back up for you as we go through this, now that you're in a bit of a different role from your past, that you would say relate to what's going on right now.
Well, I mean, the other sort of my first big investigation at the time, after I came to the Times, was the NSA wireless wiretapping story. And for those of you who don't remember this was about eavesdropping on American citizens' communications without warrants. And it was a year-long project. I was in the Washington Bureau at the time. It was a year-long project. And it was during the Bush administration, George W., and that there had been a first go-round about it, and the Times decided not to publish it, and we continued reporting, and the more reporting you do, often the better the story gets, and when the Times reached out to the administration for comment, the publisher and the editor were summoned to the Oval Office. And we were told that there would be blood on our hands if we published the story. And the argument was that we would be revealing to bad actors that their electronic devices could be traced. And there was a fair amount of information that had already been published in tech journals and stuff about the NSA's capabilities. And the real issue, it was a legal issue. It was, could we, and there was a huge dispute in the administration about whether what they were doing was legal. And that was the part that we believed that the administration was really sensitive to and did not want disclosed. There was technical information that we withheld because it wasn't necessary to understand the story, and it sort of addressed some of the concerns. But after we published, we were concerned at the time that the administration might be trying to get a restraining order. There had been a lot of discussion about that. And there had been some threats of whether we would be charged with the Espionage Act. And we accelerated the publication date. We were very the story was virtually done, but there were a few things we still had to do, and published, and it set off a huge furor. It Congress changed some of the law, and there was never any claim that we had caused any,
Bloodshed.
inability to confront some terrorist, and that was, it had a huge impact, but there were no sort of aftershocks.
Yeah. So sort of transitioning to today and what you're doing now, you work with local journalists around the country on projects that they pitch as fellows for the New York Times. And you've got this interesting window now into what local journalism is, from a very unique seat that not a lot of people are in. And I wondered, just to start, what do you think the role of local journalism is right now in our country? What do you think it needs to serve?
Well, I don't think it's so much different from what it's always intended to serve. It's to illuminate, and it's to illuminate in local journalism the lives of the people who live there, what's happening in their communities, what's the leadership of their communities, what are the concerns of people, what are the problems that ought to be addressed, what are potential solutions. But local journalism, of course, I'm sure many people are aware, is in real trouble. Since 2005, more than 3,200 newspapers have folded. And there was a recent report from the Medill Journalism School that they are disappearing at the rate of 2 a week. Of the something like 5,500 remaining newspapers, 80% of them are weeklies, which inherently can cover less than dailies can. And many of them can't do long, involved investigative journalism, which can expose, stories, hidden stories, because they don't have the resources, they don't have the support system, they, have small staffs and are stretched thin. And it also, the consequence of this, this lack of either, in-depth coverage or lack of coverage at all, is many people don't even know what's going on their communities, and there's no accountability. And there's even nothing like obituaries, which are a service to communities.
So, tough times. What keeps you going? What are you inspired by? How do you keep yourself sort of moving forward in this business, day to day, and what do you tell reporters on how to keep them going?
Well, look, I'm in a very lucky position where I work with, amazingly talented people, and I ran our investigations department for a decade before switching over to the local investigations program this summer, and it felt like sort of full circle coming back to local journalism, which I really enjoy. And we work with very talented fellows who become New York Times employees for a year. And the whole purpose of the program is and the goal of it is not to prepare them to be hired by the New York Times, but to train them more deeply in how to do investigative journalism and take it back to their home news organization and help spread sort of the culture. And we do all sorts of training with them, but they have to come with an idea that is based in their local community, about their local community. It may have national, consequences as well. And they will be published by their home organization, and in many cases, other publications in their state. I would say that some of them have done amazing work, And last year, earlier this year, one of our projects, it was actually a Baltimore project about how Baltimore had become the national leader in drug overdoses and how the city and state failed to really intervene in effective ways at all during this period. And and it was an amazing, very difficult project. They had to sue to get the data of who the overdose victims were and won. And it was sort of journalism, you know, using that required shoe leather reporting, going out, and they discovered that many of the deaths were not of younger people, but senior citizens, and senior citizen housing had become, you know, just like drug dens where there were open sales, you know, right outside them, and people who had never used drugs were lonely and isolated and somehow did, or had heroin habits years ago and had kicked it, but it was during the pandemic, and you know, there was a lot of despair, and they did amazing data analysis, which is more and more important. Data journalism is just incredibly important to being able to show the scope of problems, to analyze data and figure out what is really happening. They were incredibly powerfully told. And I mean, that's the sort of thing that local journalism can do. But you have to have, you know, the time and resources and skills to do it. But we're hoping, you know, through this program to help create more of that.
I will note that that story won the Pulitzer Prize for
It did.
local journalism.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to sit on that jury and helps pick that story. So,
Excellent.
and it is incredible. It was incredible work.
Yeah, yeah. So,
So I have just one more, and then I think we'll open it up to questions. And that's just, you and I were talking a little bit about this in the green room, but you know, for some of our staff and others who I think are here tonight that are journalists, what is a piece of advice you'd give new or young journalists today to navigate the world as it is right now?
sure. I think be curious. I mean, while I didn't intend to be a journalist. My plan when I went to college was to be a science major and go to medical school. As it turned out, during my New York Times career, I supervised not one, but two MDs, one an MD PhD. I alone diagnosed one of them with pneumonia when both of them missed it. So, you know, I think I did my medical training really well. But no, I lost my train of thought here.
Giving advice to young
All
journalists.
right. Be curious. That to me, being journalism allows you to have this passport into people's lives, and into other places, and they can be near to you. They can be all over the world, and that's an amazing privilege, and it's amazingly interesting, and that and you have to embrace, you know, it's a continuous education in many subjects. Just in the last 2 months, I've had to learn a lot about plutonium because one of my fellows this year is from Los Alamos, and she just published a story last week. I've had to learn a lot about hog farms lately. So, you know, it's ever an education. But some of our fellows, you know, just began their careers during the pandemic, or they work at these new startups that are remote and they don't have offices, and they don't quite have the experience of how wonderful newsrooms can be, and the experience. I mean, the thing I love about being an editor is the only way that you succeed and the only way you can feel happy is you have to live vicariously through your reporters. They're the ones who go out and go to these places and have these great interviews, and they come back and I say, okay, throw me some red meat. Like, what'd you learn? But But it's just an amazingly fun thing, but you learn so much from colleagues. And so you just have to, I think they need to really embrace that. And also, it can be hard at times. It can be lonely and it can be frustrating. And investigative journalism in particular, you don't know the answer. And if you did, it wouldn't be an investigative story. And sometimes it's not going to work out. And sometimes editors still decide, okay, it's an important story, it's an explanatory story, we'll do it anyway. And sometimes we say, no, reporter time is precious, and we want you to move on to something, that can be of, higher impact. But also, many of the younger reporters don't have as much experience in the actual going, knocking on doors and speaking to people. And that's like one of the biggest joys of it. And yeah, it takes more time. But, some of them are very well trained in, how to get information online, but they're missing out a little bit on that joy.
Boots on the ground. That's what we used to say.
Yeah.
Boots on the ground.
Yeah.
I will say the funny thing about working with investigative reporters and editors, and the role I serve as managing editor, is at the end, in the last week when they're working constantly, I provided the protein. I always made sure they were eating enough protein.
So what did you supply?
Like cheese sticks or beef jerky, or I had a lot of vegan, so I had to factor that in. But yeah, I feel like that was my role, was providing protein.
That's good.
It sounded like you might have needed some of that last night before you published. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I think we're going to have some time for audience questions. I'm going to hand the mic off to Strawberry.
Put your hand up, I'll come to you, or as close as I can reasonably get.
Oh, look at this. Look at this. I get to break the ice. Certainly you're part of the legacy media. Things have changed quite a bit over the years. And most people get their information from, well, I don't know about most people. Yeah, I guess most people get from other sources, most of it online. And back in the 90s, we started with this thing called Section 230. And for those that don't know, that was absolved the internet people from their liability online. All right. And we've evolved now that if most people are getting their news from social media, where those social media companies are running algorithms to push out stories to each individual that they think they would interest. Algorithms that act very much like you as an editor. All right. My question is, as a legacy media person, what is your feeling about 230? I think I don't want to, I think it's got to change. But what is you as a legacy media people think about 230 and going forward?
Well, obviously, there have been a lot of changes in where people get their information. And there are a lot of problems with misinformation, and there's a lot of problems. I'm aware of, the Section 230 issues, and that I think I'm not going to answer your question sort of more directly, because I'm not sure exactly how to address 230 more deeply in a useful way. But just the way we provide information, even being a legacy institution, has greatly changed. And the way we tell stories and try to support our information, we do, mentioned before, a lot more data analysis. We do visual investigations where the readers can see how we have journalists who can analyze photographs and videos and show the trajectory of the bullet that, hit Donald Trump's ear. And, seeing is believing sometimes more than words are. And, but, and there are all sorts of, startups across the country that are trying to do more journalism. But, and part of it is also allowing our audiences to participate more with many investigative stories. We now do reader callouts. Do you know anything? Have you had experiences with this organization or with this issue? But there's this broader question of both the news deserts across the country and people getting information from, clearly a lot of disinformation and information that is sent to them because, and they may go down deep in certain rabbit holes because that's what's sent to them. But also, to be successful, news organizations are businesses, and readers have to support them and decide that, this is useful to me. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge. And so I'm in favor of supporting journalism, just to say.
Good evening. My question is also about social media. As news articles are disseminated in many different ways across various platforms, someone might read 3 or 4 slides with sentences from an article or short clip, not the whole thing. Does that change how you edit the writing or think about how it should be written?
It doesn't. When we publish, we often do all this outreach, and it gets the same scrutiny that the stories get. It doesn't really change the writing of the stories because these are additional assets, but it doesn't mean that we always do stories in traditional ways, that we tell some stories more in just chunks of information. We tell some stories visually, where it's a visual first and then blocks of text that augment it. Our visual investigation stories are often told in the form of videos. We regard all of that as a package, but those particular SSI edited, what we call, what's the smaller one? Anyway, whatever we call it. Just last week, where it was on the Los Alamos story, and then there was like 5 slides with, a sentence or 2. And that text was mostly taken from the story, but it was a little speedier.
So I was really impressed by the point you raised about the woman as you were about to publish who called you and said, "Use my name." Mm-hmm. And you've got this incredible, both of you, this incredible kind of spectrum of experience. But right now, it's universities and law firms and companies and the press who are under attack, and with fear of repercussions being used to really change behaviors in extraordinary ways. So that fear right now, which I felt myself, I'm on the corporate side of the world, but it's there. People are changing their behavior, changing what they're willing to do, because you can be attacked and be unable to defend yourself. So what is going to happen? How is that being reflected in the media today? Do you think it's a moment? Do you think it will be used? Because the same tools can be used on both sides of the equation, by the way, if we allow them into the arsenal of tools that we use to keep people quiet. What does that mean? What does it mean to reporting, to have gone through this experience of the last few months knowing that it's likely not over?
Firstly, most journalists learn often that we shouldn't be in the prediction business because we're not particularly good at it, for one thing, and we're trying to live in the now. But it's absolutely a remarkable time, and a remarkable presidency, and it's, just every day is so much news, and we could write 50 more stories every day, and we have to choose. The issue of the sort of fear factor among various industries, which has been much written about, and there have been the broadcasting stations that reached settlements with the administration. The Times is one of the organizations that has been sued, and the lawsuit was dismissed because it was overly broad, and then was just refiled a week ago. And what I can tell you, because the publisher spoke out about it, is that this is a lawsuit that we regard without merit and is an attempt to intimidate, and it will be defended aggressively. And the Times also works in alliances with other news organizations in various lawsuits and various First Amendment fights, and supports institutions in other countries on free speech matters. And we also have put ourselves in a position where we are financially stable so that we can defend, and rather than have to concede. So.
I'm a huge supporter of the Portland and Maine papers, absolutely. I desperately want them to continue in hard copy, but that's another story. I would like to know if there is a number, a percentage across the industry of occurrences or times when a story, or when stories are considered totally, thoroughly, well vetted, well researched, that there still have to be retractions, revisions, with or without admissions. So I guess it's an investigative failure rate, which has to happen. But can you give us a number, percentage?
So just to make sure I understand the question, you're asking if
You send a story out the door.
Right.
You're sure that it's all correct, and then it's not.
Right. So retractions are a really big deal. I mean, we have not done that in my experience at the Times. I don't know, I don't have a very good sense of that across the industry. That corrections are a different matter, and we have, like on all stories, but particularly with investigative stories, we have a very, very rigorous fact-checking process, and reporters are incredibly wedded to their footnoting systems, and it makes your mind blow up when you actually see how they document everything, and the Times has a very rigorous correction policy. If there is a correction, it can be on a tiny element, but we correct it if it's wrong. But I don't know of any quantitative accounting of all of this more broadly.
I don't know if there is one. I do think that I've been very lucky to work with very, very good investigative editors in my career, and I've never been somewhere we've had to retract something. I do think that, honestly, the times I can think of that something has been retracted, it's been like a very large news story in our industry, because it doesn't happen that often. I think, you know, the vetting process for something that's an investigation is very, very intense. And to Rebecca's point, it's amazing what goes into it. It's days and days, it's documents and documents of fact checking. And I think we understand as much as anyone, sort of back to your question about fear, like what the stakes are. You know, we don't want our company to get sued, and in some cases, some of us don't have the resources the New York Times does. So if we mess up that big, you know, that could be the end of us, right? And so I think it's really important. You know, I'm very fortunate to know quite a few of the editors running newspapers around this country. I think we all have that in mind when we're about to put something out. I will say a shout out. I don't know if ours is here tonight, but media lawyers have saved my butt a lot of times, and my staff's. And having a good lawyer is like one of the top things, I think, to sort of review your big stories where you've got high stakes, and I think that's an important element too that we haven't mentioned is we have lawyers too. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if we put something out there that's false about someone that could ruin their lives, that's high stakes. You know.
I'll second the love for media lawyers, and we have a fantastic First Amendment lawyer who has written a book about First Amendment law, which you might think is really boring, but it is a fantastic read, and he's a very funny guy. David McCraw. Look for his book. I forget the name of it.
I think we are wrapping, right, Strawberry? I'm getting the sign. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for being here, and hopefully we'll get you back.